Yes, folks, Jones and Peta Credlin take no prisoners when it comes to New Zealand's virtue-signalling Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Yes, Ardern recently sided with the Pacific Island nation's demand that Australia move away from its reliance on coal. And to make matters worse, China, the worst coal polluter in the world, pretended to be woke. It pretended to be woke when it sided with the Pacific Island nations as well. Anyway, right now we'll have a listen to Alan Jones.
She's a clown, Jacinda Ardern, a complete clown. Here she is preaching on global warming and saying that we've got to do something about climate change. And I made the point very validly. Here is Jacinda Ardern. If you want to talk about the figures, if you want to talk about carbon dioxide, which I don't, nothing wrong with it. She talks about carbon. She doesn't know the difference between carbon and carbon dioxide. But the fact is, New Zealand's carbon dioxide has grown by 10.8% per capita, 10.8 since 1990, 10.8%. Ours has grown by 1.8%. I just wonder whether Scott Morrison's going to be fully briefed to shove a sock down the throat. I mean, she is a joke, this woman, an absolute and utter lightweight.
A complete lightweight. And Jones is absolutely correct there. When it comes to climate issues, I don't think many people are as knowledgeable as him. Anyway, right now we'll go and see what Credlin has to say.
Can you believe the climate change lecture that Australia's been copying from our cash grab neighbours of the South Pacific? Perhaps they've forgotten it's Australian taxpayers that bail them out to the tune of about $1.5 billion each and every year. If they remembered that, I'd suspect there would be much more gratitude and less baseless sanctimony from countries that would be in dire straits without our help. These Pacific Forum leaders who can't house and educate their own people, whose countries can't cope with the natural disasters to which the Pacific has always been prone, are now using climate change to extort more money from Australia.
Yes, that's exactly what the climate change is all about. It's about the redistribution of wealth.
At the same time as wanting us to stop exporting coal. That's the same coal that generates energy here, that generates our wealth, that enables us to be generous to them in the first place. I mean, seriously. To start with, let's be clear. This notion that Pacific Islands are on the verge of disappearing under the sea, it's rubbish. Far from sinking, the land area of Tuvalu, where this Pacific Island Humbug Festival is happening, has actually grown, not shrunk or sunk, and it's grown by 3% over the past 40 years. And 78 of Tuvalu's 101 islands, well, they've increased their land area.
Yeah, it's just a sham, folks.
Then there's that gold medal winning virtue signaller, New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who makes a hero of herself by promising that New Zealand will be carbon neutral by 2050. Now, that's a promise that she'll never be held to. It'll be almost impossibly expensive to fulfil. And wait for it, it exempts agriculture from the equation. Now, this is a joke when everyone knows that the key target for emissions reductions, these targets are energy, transport, agriculture and methane. So isn't Ardern just admitting that her promises are more about striking a pose than anything else? Because agriculture and methane make up half of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. She wants to accept them. And for all her big talk, did you know that in the first round, New Zealand contributed just $3 million to the UN's climate fund compared to Australia's $200 million? I bet Jacinda's not telling anyone that over in the South Pacific. As one of my regular guests, Graham Lloyd, reminded us of the Australian today, by the middle of the next decade, Australia will have handed over $800 million in direct climate action funding to our region, while New Zealand, a whole lot less. But getting told today that Australia needs to give up coal is like demanding that the Pacific give up fish, or like telling New Zealand to give up sheep, as Lloyd wrote. Faced with all this rent-seeking hypocrisy, Scott Morrison would be entitled to get back on his plane and fly straight home. Leave the matter. Instead, the Prime Minister, well, he has patiently explained to Pacific Islanders that in terms of emission reduction per person, Australia's record is just about the best in the world. And we actually keep our commitments on emissions reduction, unlike almost every other country. Now, as you know, I am not an emissions obsessive. Climate change is just one of the many issues we face, and by no means the most pressing. Of course, let's, minimise our use of scarce resources, but the last thing we should do is impoverish ourselves here in Australia in a futile green gesture, or take lectures from mendicant neighbours with poor records for graft and corruption cronyism and a handout mentality. What's almost even worse, though, is this new disease of Pacific Island nations playing us off against China. And I'd say to them, look to your north. Look at what's happening in Hong Kong and indeed Taiwan. Consider again, playing us off against China is all that smart.
Not smart at all.
But I have to say, most of all, it's about time all of us stop taking lectures from Jacinda Ardern.
Exactly.
She deports New Zealand criminals if they're not citizens, but complains loudly when we do the same. She wants our taxpayers to give New Zealanders welfare here, even if they're not Australians and don't pay tax. And while she tells us that we should be resettling more and more asylum seekers here in Australia, to win the last election, she did a deal with Winston Peters to cut immigration. So let's just see her for what she is. It won't be long before she heads off to the UN like her predecessor, Helen Clark. And when I caught up with some New Zealand relatives recently, I tell you what, they're hoping that day comes sooner rather than later.
Yes, Peter, and I think your relatives are not alone there. So I'll just fast forward a bit.
Same time Australia's getting bagged, the Pacific Islanders are looking to China, which has an economy based on coal-fired power, for loans. So I think there's not a lot of logic to what is being said. And I mean, and sorry, I'll get off this in a minute. But look, the other thing is Australia's emissions, if you take out land, are like 402 million tonnes. New Zealand's are about 37 million tonnes, and China's about 11 billion tonnes.
Yeah, 11 billion tonnes. Exactly. What we do here is completely meaningless when China is clearly exploiting our stupidity.
So,
yes, exactly right.
So what can you say?
Well, let me play Winston Peters' grab, because he's the guy she did a deal with, if people will remember, to hang on to government, to form government actually, it's a minority government, on the back of cuts to immigration, but she likes to lecture us to take everyone off Manus and Nauru. Let's have a listen to Winston Peters.
Many Pacific countries that are seeking loans, cheap loans from China. Now those loans are on the backs of coal-fired everything in mainland China, as we well know. So, there's a big picture we have to contemplate here, and we've got to ensure that when we act in this big picture, we act with consistency and integrity.
Now, Rita, I don't normally say I think that Winston Peters speaks a lot of sense, but he's speaking a lot of sense there. But, I mean, the way New Zealand is with Jacinda Ardern, half their emissions come from agriculture. She wants agriculture exempted for her unrealistic target. New Zealand's basically new what you would say this, would you? The outside's Wokeland. New Wokeland under...
New Wokeland. New Zealand is now New Wokeland. It certainly feels like it.
I mean, it's just crazy. She lectures the world.
Well, we should do the same. If it's good enough for them, we'll just say we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. We're just going to exclude industries such as mining and manufacturing and anything else that actually adds to our emissions. I mean, there's just an absurd point to make to say that we're going to be carbon neutral and then exclude your biggest emission item. It's
She's referring to farming there.
just absolutely absurd, but it's accepted uncritically by all the media who seem to just be her, I don't know, they seem to be almost like a fan club. There is no scrutiny of what she says. The fact that this woman came to power with this alliance, that she only got about 1 in 3 votes, that she was elected on a platform of massive cuts to immigration, none of that is ever brought up. It's always that she's just this woke warrior who's going to save the world. It is infantile.
It sure is. I'll just fast forward again.
What they're doing there, I think, is actually quite dangerous, because what they're doing is they're allowing the Pacific Island nations, and God bless them for doing it, but they're allowing them to play us off China for who they can get the most money out of, I think.
Yes, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, lecturing us on coal when that's part of our prosperity. They're happy to spend our money, Jane. And here she is, beating her chest about their climate targets that she won't be around to see implemented as PM. God help us that she lasts that long. But even so, she wants to exempt agriculture and methane from their target, but that's half of their emissions load. I mean, really and truly, does she think we don't look at the detail?
I know, I'm so glad your editorial was bang on about this tonight, Peter. I've been hot under the collar, being lectured by Jacinda Ardern, spare us all. And look, yes, they have a lot of power from hydro and the like, but, when you look at China's carbon emissions, if you want to look at carbon emissions, when you look at the hypocrisy that she is playing to, and I also think it was a really unneighbourly thing for her to have said. I see Winston Peters has had to come back and sort of walk that back. And actually, he did point out the hypocrisy of China and doing deals with China and their carbon emissions. But I thought it was really unneighbourly of Jacinda Ardern. I think James is right. She's really playing some politics there. But I'm with you, Peter. I think we'll see her end up at the UN like Helen Clark did. And probably I'm with your cousins sooner rather than later. Sooner rather than later,
Look, it used to...
Now let's listen to a different take on this story.
Jacinda, you do New Zealand right. Jacinda, you do New Zealand right. Well, you sure ain't lying like most politicians might. I got a PM the dog whistles. I got a PM that sings. I got a PM that dog whistles. I got a PM that sings. But I ain't got Jacinda, and life don't mean a thing. Jacinda, don't you mind Alan Jones? Jacinda, don't you mind Alan Jones? Well, if we're talking about lightweights, well, that's a name that he owns. Jacinda, you sure are on our minds. Jacinda, you sure are on our minds. Why don't you come to Australia? Jacinda, Jacinda, you do New Zealand right. Well, you sure ain't lying like most politicians might.
Wow, that was hard to take. And he thinks Ardern is welcome in Australia? I don't quite think so.